Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the Executive Director here at the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Happy New Year. If you're new to the center, welcome. If you're a regular, we're happy to have your continued participation and support. I know for many, especially in Southern California, 2025 has been off to a devastating start with the massive destruction of the multiple wildfires and the ensuing displacement of tens of thousands of people. As someone who lives in Los Angeles and has family members who have lost their home, I want to send my wishes and thoughts to everyone who's affected. We stand with you during this incredibly difficult time, and we send strength to everyone impacted. If you are able to make a donation towards relief efforts, we'll be dropping a link to the American Red Cross in the chat now. Switching gears, I am excited that we can begin 2025 by continuing our Fellows in the Field workshops. Fellows in the Field workshops are an opportunity for people in the field like you to hear directly from our brilliant fellows about their projects and their practical application to day-to-day life on campus. As many of you know, the center has a fellows program that brings together faculty, practitioners, and administrators who are selected in a competitive process. Fellows are awarded $20,000 and money for research in order to complete a project during their year-long fellowship. Applications for our next class of fellows will open towards the end of this month. And if you haven't had a chance to see all the terrific research of our last class, we will drop that into the link, as well as Mike and Sue's research, who you are about to hear from. I want to remind everyone you can share your questions using the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you want to enable captioning, click the button, click the button at the bottom of your screen that says turn on caption. State legislative sessions are kicking off around the country, and if you've been following the news, you'll know that we expect an increasing number of bills targeting, among other things, curriculum, tenure, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on campuses around the country. The center has spent a great deal of time documenting and discussing the detrimental impact that this type of legislation is having on campuses. But today we want to focus on effective ways that representatives of higher education can argue against these bills to legislators. We are proud that two of our fellows, Susan Balter-Reitz and Michael Bruner, have spent the 23-24 years studying the rhetorical arguments used by universities and by legislators in order to better understand the landscape we're facing and therefore to be better prepared to respond to these legislative assaults. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Sue Balter-Reitz is a professor of communication at Montana State University, Billings. She's been studying the limits of the First Amendment for the last 30 years, and she has published broadly on issues related to freedom of expression. Her work is informed by argumentation theory and conceptions of the public. Balter-Reitz has twice been nominated for the Franklin Hayman Award given by the National Communications Association to honor distinguished scholarship in freedom of expression. The work she collaborated on with Michael Bruner won this award in 2015. The other part of this dynamic duo is Michael Bruner, who is a professor of communication studies and affiliate professor of public policy at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with a well-established reputation for research in freedom of speech and civic engagement. Mike's work in these areas, spanning more than 2 decades, focuses primarily on legal rulings and legislation that appear on the surface to protect and expand free speech and citizen engagement, when in fact, they undermine the very public reason upon which sound legal and policy decisions are based. Michael also ensures that his work on responsible public speech and civic engagement is applied. To that end, he teaches development and communication to policy professionals at the doctoral level and collaborative debate at the undergraduate level. And in addition to these incredible bios, they are both wonderful people. Sue and Mike, so happy to be in conversation with you both. Before we turn it over to you to share the results of your research, I'd love to ask you to share what sparked your interest in this topic and why you decided to focus on the Forum Act in particular.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for hosting us. I'm looking forward to talking with everyone. Mike and I have been working together for many years. We met in graduate school, In 2022, we wrote a paper on a case where Turning Point USA was suing a university for not allowing it to table on a public space. And the case was actually stopped because of the Forum Act, which passed in the state where the case was in Arkansas. Mike and I were really intrigued by this because when we started studying Turning Point USA, we found quite a bit of policy groups that had a very important, impactful structure, but were really below the radar. And so the Forum Act clearly emerged as something that we saw developing and having a large impact on higher education. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Forum Act once we get into our presentation.
Thanks so much. And now I'm going to ask a question on this webinar that I've had to ask both of you in the past, given that I am not a communications scholar. I have had the privilege of reading your research and learning so much from the two of you over the last year and a half. And so here's my table setting question, and that is, when you talk about rhetorical strategies, what does that mean for those of us that are not communication experts?
Excellent question. Rhetoric is misunderstood in the broad public sphere because it's associated with false speech, or, well, that's just the rhetoric coming out. But in fact, rhetoric, most simply put, is the art of persuasion. And so when we talk about a rhetorical strategy, we're talking about an intentional approach to persuade publics. Now, it's not that simple. In light of contemporary theory, we know there are many unconscious influences and structural influences that transcend intentionality. But for the purposes of our presentation today, rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and rhetorical strategies means how does one act in different audience settings to get what they want.
Okay, great. I think that's enough to get us started. And so what I'm going to do now is turn the proverbial stage over to you to give us some background. And I'm going to encourage participants, particularly today, to be thinking of questions because Mike and Sue are particularly adept at engaging with people. And I know they want to answer questions and hear thoughts. So Mike and Sue, take it away.
Thank you. And we will go pretty quickly through this. Please feel free to throw questions. Michelle will let us know if there's something we should answer as we're going along. But Mike and I have really thought about what it is we want to communicate. And what we've determined is that we are really interested in the concept of public reason and the concept of public unreasonableness. And so when we ask the question, does reason prevail? I will just let you know the end at the beginning. The answer is rarely. So Melanie, would you go to the next slide? Just a quick thank you. We were part of an amazing class of fellows who asked us some incredibly wonderful questions and were amazing at helping us frame and think through this. Additionally, we could not have done this research without the support of Karen Tidgwell. She was our research fellow. She is currently a first-year law student after she finished her doctorate in public policy, and we are so grateful for her work, which is stunning. So let me talk a little bit about, did you want to throw in something about Karen, Mike?
Sure, her work is stunning, but I also just want to say how honored we are to work with the center and to have a distinguished audience such as we have with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So let me quickly talk about the Forming Open and Robust University Minds Act. This act was introduced in 2017 by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which centers itself as a non-partisan free market exchange theory. However, it is deeply rooted in conservatism and also is funded heavily by industry. So on surface, it attempts to be nonpartisan, but in practice, it is very conservative. And most of the bills that are brought forward by conservative lawmakers. ALEC, like many other public policy think tanks, writes ready-made legislation that is intended to be passed in state legislatures. Mike and I were very surprised to find out that the majority of legislatures around the United States are in fact citizen legislatures, several of which have term limits, which means that these legislatures are made up of people who don't have significant public policy backgrounds and also don't have the time, research, and funding to do the type of deep work needed to pass this kind of sophisticated legislation. I'm going to be very clear that we are not against prepackaged legislation, but there are definitely places where it short circuits public argument, and this is one of the things that we have seen. The Forum Act in particular was designed to ensure that universities were places that were open to a variety of thoughts. There are 7 protections. I'm not going to go through them all in the model legislation. Not all of them are passed across every one of the universities, but the forum provisions include eliminating speech zones, and this is a really interesting rhetorical strategy that we'll talk about a little bit later. Ensure that all people, not just students and faculty, are protected, and that's also partially the disinvited speaker plank. To protect belief-based student groups, to make sure that they are given the same opportunities as student groups that are not belief-based, requires First Amendment education. And then there's 2 pieces of this that actually have financial implications for higher education. Students can sue for what they see as limits on their First Amendment rights, and there's some very significant support for student suits, including in some cases taking the time limit off when students can file a suit. Higher education also has to report their activities under the bill, and depending on how this is passed, some of them are required to report yearly on any types of violations as reported by students of the Forum Act. Melanie, could you go to the next one? This has been a particularly popular piece of legislation. At the time that we presented in 2024, 26 states had some version of the Forum Act. The 2 states, Utah and Arizona, that you see with the red checks, that's actually the Goldwater Institute Free Speech Act, but it has some similarities to the Forum Act. But even though most of our research was on the Forum Act through the 2020 legislative season, it is still ongoing. And in fact, New Hampshire just passed the Forum Act in July of 2024. So you can see, even though there's new and better legislation regarding DEI, academic freedom, and tenure, that the Forum Act continues to have some sway. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike for the next slide.
Yes, and so we believe that the strategies that we're going to be discussing here are the people that are presenting them are learning, and that the university system so far is not. In other words, we assume that the legislation that will be coming regarding DEI, tenure, faculty governance, things like this, will follow a similar pattern because it's working. Here, we're simply showing you the states that we chose and why, and let me explain why we chose them. Basically, we were looking to ensure that we had examples where there was relatively mixed and balanced government, and then we wanted examples where trifectas and supermajorities prevailed. And this is where one party dominates with sufficient numbers that they do not necessarily have to do any real compromising with their opposition. You can see that the states that we chose, also because of the wide quantity of data that was available to us, both visual and textual, were Louisiana, Kentucky, Texas, Maryland, and Ohio. If we could go to the next slide, please. Theoretically, this is the key to our argument. At the trough of this inverted bell curve is a theoretically legislative environment with rich systems of checks and balances. So at the bottom of the trough, when we say reason rarely prevails, doesn't mean that it never prevails. No, in certain legislative environments where there are strong systems of checks and balances and where there are no trifectas or supermajorities, arguments must be responded to. Arguments must be listened to. Fact-based concerns have to be addressed. But as we climb the walls of this inverted bell curve, we start moving away from reason and towards what we're calling in shorthand performances. And these performances have very little to do with what in ancient Greek we called logos. And not to get too wonky here, we'll keep it very simple. There are basically three ancient Greek concepts for types of argument. Logical arguments, where they occur at the bottom of the trough. And then as we climb the sides, we move into what are called ethical appeals, or appeals to character, and drawing upon emotion. And so we become more performative as we rise up the sides of this chart. And what we have attempted to do here is show you where the level of reason was in the 5 different states. Now, because time is limited, I'm only going to provide 2 examples. Now, as you can see, the left of the graph would represent the political left, because obviously the left can have trifectas and supermajorities just as well as the right. It just so happened, because this is conservative legislation, that the majority of the examples that we have are on the right-hand side. To illustrate, though, the different ways that these performative problematics occur, I'd just like to mention 2 of them. Louisiana, which is relatively close to reasonable, and Texas, which was, in our opinion, the most performative, the least reasonable, for reasons I'll quickly go into. Louisiana provides an interesting case of a productive type of performance that led to reason and dialogue across the parties. Here, a leading politician came out playing stupid and establishing his ethos as a good old boy who got smart by going to college and learning about Beethoven. And he, in doing so, played stupid, saying, well, you're just getting all lawyerly on me, or I'm just here to smoke out the critters. You know, he was using these very colloquial frames. But sure enough, he got people raising their concerns and their issues in response, and he had his aides right there writing them all down. And by the time the legislation had actually moved through this early kind of good old boy process, the project was turned over to a far more serious and well-informed politician who then took it from there once the main concerns had been smoked out. Still, it's interesting because the fellow who played stupid, of course, knew exactly what was going on. When he said, oh, you're getting all lawyerly on me, no, he knew exactly what they meant. And he also knew that he was fighting for belief-based speech in a university setting, although he would acted too dumb to know that. Now, again, this is a form of performance that's a little bit cynical, but is actually productive in the sense that it led to dialogue. Texas, on the other hand, is a whole nother story. In Texas, which you can see is at the highest level of performance on our graph, a highly elaborate and fully cynical performance was produced, including a fake open hearing with university officials who were assured that everything was fine. But then it was followed by hearings to which they were not invited, where a parade of victims of conservative speech oppression were sympathetically presented, with one of the politicians running the event saying that they were, quote, victims for a great cause, unquote. And that being, of course, fighting for belief-based speech on university campuses. Look, clearly, universities, in our opinion, need to find different ways to perform themselves in these different legislative settings. And in order to kind of set up like how these clashes went in practice, where the legislative performances were in contact with the university performances or the university's ways of reacting, I'm going to turn that over to Sue.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to start by talking a little bit. Have you got a chance to move that slide forward, Melanie? There we go. I want to start by talking a little bit about the way that higher education is characterized across the 5 states that we saw. As you can see from the words that we have on our slide, these characterizations mirror what is being articulated in the media. And so one of the things that we have learned as we've gone through this is that there's an incredible collaboration, and universities are one of many victims of what we're calling the conservative thought matrix, which is essentially a way that the Conservative Party has assured itself that it can, even when it's not in power, have some kind of way to engage in the public sphere. And of course, now that we're seeing a majority of our state legislatures on the right, we're seeing more and more attacks on what started as a media attack is now a legislative attack. But I want to talk about two states in particular as I talk about the characterization of higher education. And I want to reinforce something that Mike said earlier. What we noticed across all of our case studies was the evolution of argument against higher education. And so I'm going to start with Kentucky, which was one of the first states to float the Forum Act. The first time Kentucky floated the Forum Act, it was a single Senator Schroeder who got up in front of the Senate and essentially made an argument about the nature of higher education that really just didn't go anywhere. A year later, after learning something about rhetorical strategy, Schroeder is no longer the face of this bill. Instead, it goes to the House. And the face of the bill becomes two students who represent different elements or different sides of the ideological spectrum. So there is a gay student leader and a conservative student leader. The gay student leader self-identifies as a Democrat, and they tell story after story of an evil institution who is silencing voices. My particular favorite is the suppression of Free Hug Day at the University of Kentucky, where this poor student is near tears as he talks about the university police not allowing students to give free hugs. That kind of pathos is answered by nothing but logos. In fact, in Kentucky, we have an alternative answer, which is it's not our problem. We're not worried about this. We are already consistent with what we think the Forum Act is going to do. But let's talk a little bit about Ohio. Ohio is another one of those states that learned. So in the first iteration of the Forum Act, there were some very similar types of argument structures, but it was the second iteration that passed this bill. In the second iteration, the supporters of the Forum bill marched 12 students to the stand, all of whom testified about the vicious quieting of student voices on campus. The response was by 3 different organizations of faculty, all extraordinarily well-reasoned and incredibly wonky, working on policy issues in the face of these students who clearly were in distress about the way that they felt they had been treated. Although one of the caveats of this is only one student actually had a direct impact from in higher education. The rest of them were speaking on behalf of others. As Mike and I theorized this, what we realized is that this was a melodrama. It kind of reminds me of Snidely Whiplash, right? And the student is tied to the railroad track, and in the higher education becomes the guy with the mustache, and it's the legislature who is running in as the Mountie to save the poor student tied to the railroad track. Can we go to the next slide? So how does higher education respond? It turns out very consistently and with absolutely no change based on the rhetorical structure, the rhetorical environment. Michelle and I and Michael talked a little bit about it, and we call it the one-trick pony. It's logos-based, and essentially the consistent response we hear is, we don't need this. We're already doing it. So regardless of the argument put on in support of the Forum Act, higher education's response at best was to talk a little bit about the types of freedoms on their campuses with very little detail, and at worst, which is Kentucky, to just assume that this wasn't an important thing for them to address. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mike. Now that we've seen this, what do we think are the ways that higher education can improve the way that they are defending themselves?
And we hope that in our dialogue period that we can go into more detail, but let's just summarize some very basic principles that are takeaways from what we have studied. One, university communicators need to be aware that there are different legislative performative environments, and they cannot assume that reason will prevail and that logos will dominate. No, all the facts in the world won't change people when they're crying over a victim. And so universities need to start thinking about their own performances of ethos, particularly, and pathos as needed to meet these performative challenges. Also, just as a general rule, the greater the dominance of a single party, especially when they have mathematical dominance, the more sophisticated performances that counter that party's ideology must become, because reason does not have to prevail. In other words, no one has to listen to anybody. And so it's very important that when we move into legislative environments that are not governed by good systems of checks and balances, that universities are aware of that. Be aware that there are two kinds of performances going on. And again, this is a little bit of rhetoric and law language, but there are those who we say enjoy presumption. In other words, everyone already believes them. Think of precedent in law, as opposed to someone who wants to change the rules or make an argument that the status quo is insufficient. They have the burden of proof because, after all, the reason of the past has already led to the current status quo. And so there's this balance between who sits in the seat of presumption and who sits in the seat of the burden of proof. And in these university settings, that gets very complicated very quickly.
And Mike, I'd like to jump in for a second.
Yes.
One of the things that happens in this argument structure, and I think is happening across all of these, is that higher education believes it has presumption, but they actually have the burden of proof.
Exactly. And then finally, because I'll turn the last few over to Sue, those with the burden of proof, which in this case is actually the university, need to start learning to deploy the resources of ethos and pathos more aggressively in these more difficult ideological environments. Playing the long game may not be effective in the short term, but get that media out there of a re-representation of the ethos of the university, drawing upon emotional arguments as well, because that's what they're facing. Sue, I'll turn those last three over to you.
So we've already talked a little bit about how well that ALEC and the sides that were supporting ALEC brought in proxies. They brought students in, and they brought in others to tell the story for themselves. We never saw higher ed bring a student in to speak. They never brought in anybody on their own campus. Even when we saw faculty, they were generally faculty organizations as opposed to faculty who represented the actual institution themselves. And we understand it is really difficult to coordinate a legislative witness list. And I know, and one of the things Mike and I can't get to is who wasn't invited, right? So that's part of this is how do you ensure that you're getting invited? One of the things that we stumbled across in our research that really resonated with us is the change of the way that higher education has been branding itself in the last decade. So the narratives that the public sees about higher education, one of my friends who works in university communication calls it the 3 under a tree picture. So it's the bucolic campus with these beautiful students sitting, studying, or Mike talks a little bit about the football games, but we don't really talk about the value of higher education. What does it bring to the community? What does it bring to the institution? It's really difficult when forces are requiring higher ed to market share because of FTE calculations, tuition dependence. It's really hard to break that piece of money and time necessary to create the larger picture of the value of higher education to society. But if your community doesn't support you, if all they see is the pretty pictures of a place that's separate from them, it reinforces the separation of higher ed from the good of society. And Mike's already talked a little bit about how to play the long game. And I think that unless Mike wants to add anything, we are ready for some questions.
Because clearly we have to move quickly to have time for questions, and that's what we want to do now.
Well, as people formulate their questions and thoughts, I just want to say thank you. I always learn something new from you every time I hear you talk about this issue. So while I give people an opportunity to write in some questions, I, of course, have plenty. And I think one of them has to do with what does it mean to be making these rhetorical arguments in an environment where truth, kind of in quotes, can't necessarily be agreed upon or pinned down. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that, because I think where I'm going with that is then to say, what does that mean for someone who represents an institution of higher learning to be sort of pushed to use, rhetorical strategies that don't rely on truth when, of course, what we are in search of is knowledge and truth. So it's kind of a big question, but I'll let you two figure out how you're going to divide it up.
So I have to jump in right off the bat because
Yeah.
I'm not sure that ethos is necessarily anti-truth. It's all about character. Universities have a character. The question is, what is it? What the legislatures have a character. You can't just go in there and say whatever you think. There's rules because they're doing important business. Courts, you just can't go in and say whatever you think. They're doing important business. They've got rules. Universities apparently are like public parks. And so what's going on here, that one of the main vehicles of educating the public, not only for workforce development, but for that horrible critical thinking stuff that doesn't make a profit, how do we find ways to do this? But briefly, I'm saying that the techniques that have to be used are storytelling and humor. Now, that's in a nutshell. Boy, I could go into a little lot of details about what that means. But in positions where logos doesn't prevail, it becomes a battle of characterizations. That doesn't mean we leave truth behind. As a matter of fact, one of the main functions of humor is to reveal the blindsidedness of the people who are pretending to be ethical. And that's when humor comes into play. And again, the long game here too. Who are we talking to? Are we actually talking to these legislatures? No, we're talking to the public. And we're leaving a record of humor and characterizations that they can reflect on that will change their prejudices that are actually anti-truth. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Sue.
So I just want to add, I think it's really important that the legislatures, by and large, are working in good faith, right? They are charged with doing what's best for their constituency, and their truth is what they're coming to bear with. And as Mike said, their truth may not actually mean that they understand the complexity of higher education. So it's really easy to shortcut. The more complicated an argument or a structure is, the more people look for those quick shortcuts to understanding. And I think that that is part of the responsibility of higher education, is that they have to be willing to engage, and they have to engage more broadly than what we've seen so far.
Great. So I knew it wouldn't take long. We already have a couple good questions in the queue. So I'm going to start with those. The first one says, recognizing that rhetoric requires tailored messaging, did you see any examples of a university suffering from a reputation for either inconsistency, pandering, different messages in different spaces, or do you think that concern is overblown?
Ooh, that's a good one. Go, Mike.
Well, I just have to laugh and say, well, how many examples do we need of university presidents being fired to show that no, they're not adapting to the circumstances? But Sue, I'll turn it over to you. I'm just saying the answer to me is like, oh my God, the evidence all is kind of against the universities. They look very rhetorically unsophisticated.
So we haven't actually seen inconsistencies in our little slice of this legislative research. We
Yes.
don't know that what happens on the ground, right? So we don't know if, for example, a legislator who lives in Lexington, Kentucky has been booted off of campus, right? So that's a problem. But what we did see is I just lost it, but it was about consistency. What we did see was an incredible consistency of rhetoric that just reinforced the detachment of higher ed. So it was all based on principles.
The university literally stepped into the hole that was created by the Snidely Whiplash narrative. I mean, now, one real quick add-on there, don't forget the citizen legislature issue. It's very important because it's a structural issue that has to be addressed. These are well-meaning people who just have very limited access to information, and they have motivated people providing them with ready-made information. And in the economy of time itself, when you're a citizen legislator, who's got time or the staff to really do the work, which is why no matter how truth-oriented we want to be, we need to learn that storytelling is part of that. It's not just facts and figures and legal statistics, which is what the universities usually bring to bear. They'll bring like their legal representative with them or someone from their affirmative action office. It's always very technical. And they fall right into the out of touch, wonky characterization that they are cast by.
And it's argument from enthymeme, right? It's argument from, of course, we adhere to these principles, which require your audience to fill in the missing piece, but the audience doesn't believe the missing piece.
Yeah, let me just restate what she just said, because that was a bit complicated. In rhetoric, we have syllogisms, which are like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's like scientific reasoning. But then we also have where we just draw upon the audience's beliefs to conclude the syllogism. So all we have to do is say, well, we all know about the last election. Oh, well, who are we talking to? Right. And because the audience will just automatically go, yeah, one way or the other. And so artful rhetors don't spell everything out in full syllogistic detail. They drop little hints because they know the audience is going to answer it for them. Okay.
I think this might be the first webinar we've done where we are using the word syllogism more than one time. This is so fun. Okay, couple more questions. Have a great question that talks about, so what are speakers' perspectives on the tactic of higher education institutions and related organizations moving away from terminology like DEI and equity? Many of us worry that giving away our language is the first step towards stopping the work under the umbrella of those terms, as evidenced by that reality in Florida and Texas, where the banning of terminology eventually led to dissolution of initiatives and layoffs of staff. What do you think?
Wow, Sue, I'll turn that over to you.
I can't even begin to have an idea about that, but I haven't actually gotten to watch this yet, but the state of Idaho just brought the head of the Northwest Commission of Colleges and Universities to the legislature to talk about that commission's equity engagement. And I heard it was pretty brutal. I have to see it yet. And the Northwest Commission doesn't use DEI, right? It uses equity as its term to encompass DEI, but even that is being attacked. So any sense of equity is being attacked. In terms of language, I mean, I think as communication scholars, language creates reality. So in my mind, I am horrified by that attack, but I don't know what the right answer is. I think it depends on what your values are, right? I mean, if you can still do the work without the language, it's not as powerful, but hopefully you're helping students, faculty, and staff, even if you can't say DEI. But I mean, I hate to take a stand.
Well, I think, that was a hard question, but I wanted just to put it out there. And I think that could be the topic for a different webinar, which is about, what does it mean to step away from or lean into certain language? Continuing on, I don't know, I'm guessing this one.
What do you want to say? Do you want to
course,
add?
of
I'm
course.
sorry, Mike.
Well, look, I just wanted the person who asked that question to know that I understood it. If we change our language, are we not maybe watering down our principles? And we have empirical proof that in doing so, it opens the gates for legislation that actually harms our efforts. So I do understand the question. I think that what's required is more detailed case studies of legislative environments, because in addition to these performances, there are dialogues that go on behind the scenes. There are moderate kind of voices handshaking in the background. And without really knowing what those are, it's kind of hard to know even what change of wording might be that would not give up the values, but could persuade those moderate voices in a way that won't alienate their constituencies who enthematically tie terms like critical race theory and things like that to the woke left. And so, again, the challenge is balancing these enthematic powers with ensuring that we're fighting for the values and the principles that we most dearly believe in that are central to a democratic process. So, but I just think more research is needed at a more detailed, concrete level, because the rhetorical strategies need to be unique to every legislative environment. We've just given a general scale at this point. Anyway, I know there's more questions, so I'll leave it at that.
There are, and we do have one participant who mentioned, and I believe this is in response to the question about language. It just reads, we've been using broadening participation for a long time, and that works pretty well. So I think the next question, if I'm guessing, and I might be guessing wrong, might be for Mike, but you'll tell me. This person writes, humor is hard. Can we really expect college and university administrators with all the constraints they operate under to effectively use humor to help themselves?
Oh. Let's just be honest. I mean, yes, everybody knows who's a good writer, that humor is the most difficult thing. Because it is a subtle art where you want to avoid satire. American humor is a particular kind of kindly humor. And so even to understand the different types of humor that might be deployed would require consulting and performance. And so, no, the quick answer is I do think it is a bit unrealistic. That's why I think storytelling is the first go-to proxies is the first, because proxies national branding of education is first. In legislative settings, proxies are next. After that, through the proxies and officials, when it's appropriate, storytelling, because then you can start kicking out those enthematic problems. Humor, though, is the most sophisticated, especially when it unmasks corruption and blind spots in discourse, because the people who are creating the blind spots or have them are usually either cynical and aware of them, or they just don't know. Real quick, an example would be when you all may remember when Stewart went on the Crossfire. This was many, many years ago, and basically said, why are you running America? You make it sound like there's two sides to everything and that everyone's wrong, and you're really just selling soap. And then the poor guy announcing it goes, oh, I'm sorry, we have to stop. And he held up like a sign for like their advertiser. And it was like, oh my God, right? Like, how stupid could you be? And yet that show Crossfire was off the air within a month. So
I want to add, I'm sorry, Mike. I just want to add quickly, humor is about power. And this is something that's really challenging, and we don't have an answer. And it goes back to what Mike was saying. It's a case by case. Anytime you use humor, you're putting yourself in a place where you're either overpowering. So you think of like Andrew Dice Clay in that angry humor, or where you're the fool, right? And so you can speak truth because you're the clown or the fool. Both of those are really difficult positions for higher education leadership to be in. But it is also a really good way kind of outside of the legislative environment to create this aha moment, which is the other thing that humor does, is it allows people to see things in a way that's different from the way that they're patterned. So I agree with Mike. I don't think it's something that we can say to like the president of the University of California, hey, go out and crack
on your Joker belt cap and go, oh, I'm just kidding. But that's an excellent question, and I hate to be so negative on it, because I'd like to be able to say, come on, we're smart people, we can use humor. But no, I really do think it would require a case-by-case consulting kind of situation. But you don't need consulting to bring in proxies who provide a counter narrative. You don't need a lot of sophisticated theory to know how to tell a story that isn't an argument, but you're simply presenting a situation. And that is a counter situation to the narrative that's being provided by the people supporting these bills. And I guarantee you the pity parade will just start marching on and on. Just wait. The victimhood party will not stop. And if universities don't find a way of showing that they're the hero instead of the Snidely Whiplash, all is lost. Yeah. So
I think that's a great lead into the next questions that are kind of twofold. Let's start with how can how can individual faculty members employ these rhetorical strategies when they interact with legislators? And maybe that's even in a more of a one-on-one setting or not necessarily at a hearing. I'm adding that in. And the second part of that is how is that employment of the rhetorical strategy different than what an upper level administrator might be doing? So
Why don't we start?
the second half makes me laugh. So you please
Okay,
take
I'm
the
going to
second
start
half.
with the first half. I think that faculty are in a really uniquely powerful place
Yes.
to create relationships with legislatures, but also in communities. When I get to talk about the things that my students do as part of the community, people get really excited about that. They understand the value of the work being done in higher education. And so it's super easy, I think, to talk about how service learning has helped the community of Billings, for example. It's in how the skill sets that I teach in public advocacy have helped nonprofits around the city. I think as a faculty member, the work that I do within the city, the volunteer work I do gets noticed. And so that all adds to the value of the university to the community. The main thing I think is just leading from example of the value. I don't know it needs to be a direct argument about, well, this is why I value conservative speech. Instead, it is the indirect, here's how we've broadened the ability of our students to think and to learn and to contribute to the place that they live and work.
I couldn't agree with Sue more. I was just in Missouri having a meeting with several conservative legislatures, and they fell head over heels in love with the notion of collaborative argument. They had no idea what that meant. They said, what's collaborative argument? And I go, well, that's when you get all the stakeholders together who share different values and they have to kind of recognize it. And he goes, oh my God, we don't do that. And it was like, but not only that, another technique that I would recommend when you're dealing with the legislators is avoid the third rail questions. When I was in Missouri, I was immediately asked, where are you from? And the typical questions. But when it came to, what do you think about Trump's election? Or what do you think, which church do you go to? It was very easy for me to say, well, how's your uncle's health? Right? Or how's your grandmother's knee? And I swear, building that common ground and bypassing these kind of enthematic third rail issues, most of these citizen legislatures that I have been meeting are really pretty good folks. They just have a vision of what the university is that isn't about public policy and critical thinking. What's that? That already makes them nervous, right? So it's a collaborative argument, working in teams, learning to listen to other people's values, sharing, stories of common good. So I on that. Now, when it comes to the second part, I really can't answer because my relationship usually with upper administration is that it's very wonky and technical and just the opposite of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that human touch. And I think that university professors are uniquely positioned to interact with their legislators in ways that upper administration is not. But that's my prejudice.
okay, we're just going to keep going.
Great. Thank you for the questions, everyone.
No,
Really,
I'm thrilled. So this person says, I'm curious if you could speak a bit more towards the impact of and how this shows up with private institutions versus public institutions with the legislature, and how that's coming through as well with interactions with legislature. So public-private.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
bingo.
Actually,
It's a bingo question. It's a
it
bingo
is
question.
a great question. So most people don't differentiate that, right? to them, an institution is an institution, and they don't understand the different First Amendment requirements between a public institution and a private institution. All they know is it's higher ed. We saw that last year when the mainly private Ivy League institutions were brought out to defend themselves in Congress, but Texas did this. And in fact, at one point, during the first part of the Texas hearings where they allowed higher education to make arguments in defense of themselves, they had the president of Baylor who said, well, this doesn't apply to me. And one of the legislatures said, in all honesty, it absolutely does. And so I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the First Amendment as it applies to different types of institutions. And Mike, why don't you take it from there? Because I've run it out.
I read the question differently, but I'm glad to hear that angle on it. And perhaps the person who asked the question, if I've got it wrong, let me know. We don't really have time to tell the story, but the right is very organized. And the left tends not to have the long-term strategy that we have seen on the right. When Nixon got in trouble, there was all kinds of movements to strengthen think tanks, media outlets, local elections, because they were concerned they were going to lose the presidency and the Supreme Court for perhaps a couple of generations. I mean, now those crimes seem like nothing. But the fact is that the universities need to start also doing the same thing. They need to be working with experts in major media outlets. They need to be working with different public groups like think tanks in a more aggressive way on a long-term strategy, because these things don't develop overnight. Sue, do you remember when ALEC was formed? Wasn't it like 1982? I mean, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago.
It took a while for the tree to produce its fruit, so to speak. And so I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question, but it's not just a matter for me of the public versus private universities and their First Amendment differences, although that's important, but how are universities drawing upon broad public resources to tell this new story of why they're not a public park? You know, that they're like a court or like a legislature. They must protect and defend what they do. What's that? Football? Throwing caps up in the air? Sitting under a tree and reading a book? No. I mean, so again, where this national campaign is going to go for, first thing I'd be doing, well, I am doing, is working with people from CNN and other networks that are interested in these issues. But I don't have the $20 million to start the campaign, so that's another issue. I'm not sure if we answered that question as directly as it was meant to be posed.
Well,
1973 for ALEC. 1973 for ALEC.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll ask each of you to kind of do a final word. This question says, how would the speakers approach the issue that in much of higher ed, and including within the UC system, there's a disparity in representation of a range of identities, such as race, gender identity, and class, and institutional leadership? How does this affect framing rhetorical strategies as authentic to a more diverse learner population and surrounding communities? Great question, big one. Who goes first?
This is part of what Mike and I've talked about, and that is very rarely did we see anyone speak on behalf of two-year colleges. We never saw anyone speak on behalf of tribal colleges. It seems like in the structures that public higher education is built, that it's so hierarchical, and it erases difference, not just identity difference and economic difference, but also the goals of different types of institutions. So I think what the speaker is saying is really, really interesting, and it gets at the heart of this monolithic vision of higher education that we see consistently stereotyped. And Mike, I know I jumped in front of you, as I always do.
Well, no, good. Thank God you do. I just know that I'm never sure that I completely understand the question, so I'm going to restate it. And if I've got it wrong, I've got it wrong. In many ways, upper administrations and universities do not reflect the diversity of the student population and the people that we're trying to defend. And so how do we bring those voices forward in a situation where it really does not exist in a mathematical way at the upper divisions as it is in the middle divisions? Proxies is an excellent way of doing this. Advertisers do a great job of this. I don't know if you see, there was a recent ad where there's this young white boy with his mother at the grocery store, and he looks over at this woman who's black and goes, "Oh, look at her mom." And her mom kind of looks embarrassed, and the woman kind of looks embarrassed, like, and she's, "Isn't she beautiful?" Right. And so I'm just saying there's ways of storytelling, and I'm repeating myself, but there's ways of undermining what everyone thinks. And if it can't be done by the official representatives, get them out. Get them out of the performance. Get proxies in. Get people who we can say, "Oh, that's the people." And again, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question directly, but this is a crisis. I think that most of the people defending the universities are very wonky people who look very out of touch with the kinds of feelings that are involved by marginalization. And one of the main reasons we're seeing this conservative backlash from the Midwest and the South is because they feel like they are a marginalized and overlooked population. And when you start celebrating difference that's not them, that is a direct accusation of their racism and their prejudice, right? And so it's a double-edged sword of artful storytelling. And if we had another couple of hours and a couple of years to think about it, I bet we'd be able to give more precise advice on that.
We do have more time. It just might not be on this webinar. And so I'm going to go ahead and put myself out there and say that if anybody who participated today would like to follow up with either Michael or Sue, I anticipate they would be happy to hear from you. And as you can sense from the two of them, they have an amazing energy, which is contagious, and definitely are experts on humor. I'm an expert on earnestness, so I'm not the right person to be going with the rhetorical strategies. But really fast, do either of you want to add any last thing before I kind of close this out with a little bit of center news?
First, Mike.
Well, again, I'm just honored to be in the conversation with all of the people that run the center and the audience here. We are fighting for the principles that will save the republic. Benjamin Franklin said, "Well, good luck, here you got it." That means you got to have a smart middle class who knows how to make decisions on complex things. And because of the profit motive in universities, we're seeing a decimation of the liberal arts and the places where you learn critical thinking. In my own school, we just cut the graduate program in communication studies because it's not making money. Well, so again, back to the branding issues, but just know that I believe that everyone here is fighting for the heart of what my uncles and died for in wars. And I just couldn't be more honored to be in conversation with these people.
Just add that it is a long game, and it is not, it's going to be rough. I don't want to at all say follow our 7 rules and everything will be great. It is going to be a rough few years, but what's going to help is building these relationships. And not every school, even in red states, is suffering. And so Mike and I need to spend a little bit of time looking at the higher education institutions that are thriving legislatively to try to figure out what are they doing.
Last thing I would add, and I'll be very brief here, when I was speaking with the conservative legislatures, I was aware of the enthymematic red flag. So when I said I'm a university professor, I immediately said, and I teach critical, I didn't say critical thinking. I didn't use the word critical, right? I said, I teach public policy and collaborative argument. And then they were okay. But I had to reassure them, and I know that's offensive to people who want to fight for their principles. I'm just saying you need to be careful because the language you use will trigger reaction that will shut down dialogue. And if you can stay true to your principles, which I believe I do, and find just ways of avoiding those third rails, you can build good relationships with these well-meaning, good-hearted, half out of their minds citizen legislators.
Okay, well, we will end there. I will just thank you both again, and just let people know that we'll be dropping our first episode of our Speech Matters podcast next week. We'll please mark your calendars for our Speech Matters conference on April 10th, and we're going to have our final Fellows in the Field in March. And I just want to say again, Sue, you don't need to disappear. Don't disappear. Let me just reiterate my thanks to our former fellows, and wish everybody a good and safe rest of the week.